sorrows in our hearts that went unspoken, and one for those who have no one with which to share their joys and sorrows. Please stand as you are willing and able to join in singing hymn number 163, For the Earth Forever Turning. At this point, we are going to do a responsive reading. Please turn to number 575 in the back of the hymnal. I will be reading the boldface, and you will join in the italics. Number 575, A New Manifestation. A new manifestation is at hand, a new hour is come.
When man and woman may regard one another as brother and sister, able both to appreciate and to prophesy to one another.
A new manifestation is at hand, a new hour is come.
What woman needs is not as a woman to act or rule, but as a nature to grow, as an intelligence to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded, to unfold such powers as were given to her.
A new manifestation is at hand, a new hour is come.
Man does not have his fair share either. His energies are repressed and distorted by the interposition of artificial obstacles.
A new manifestation is at hand, a new hour is come.
We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to a woman as freely as to man.
Were this done, we believe a divine energy would pervade nature to a degree unknown in the history of former ages.
A new manifestation is at hand. A new hour is come.
Okay, I get to introduce our speaker, a very familiar face. One of the things I love about coming to this church is to interact with all of the talented people we have in our congregation. We have many people who bring so many good talents to our church, and today is no exception. I talked to Lisa before the service, and I said, well, tell me some things so I could introduce you. And she shared with me that she's been a UU since 1960, which I think is pretty impressive. I was actually born in 1960. She is a member of the Mankato Fellowship in Minnesota also. So it is my pleasure to introduce Lisa Cook.
This is from a sermon by a very good friend of mine, a minister from Minneapolis, who retired quite a few years ago after about 21 years at that church. He wrote this in 1991. So some of the things may be a little out of date, but it is about Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller, it was written by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, possessed more influence on the thought of American women than any woman previous to her time. She was an author, editor, and teacher. Actually, she was the first woman employee of the New York Tribune. Horace Greeley met her and was very impressed with her and hired her. She contributed significantly to the American Renaissance in literature and to mid-19th century reform movements. A brilliant and highly educated member of the Transcendental group, she challenged Ralph Waldo Emerson both intellectually and emotionally. Women who attended her conversations, she sort of had salons and people paid to go and talk to her. And these were conversations. She did not talk to the people and have them listen and take notes. She expected them to converse with her, and this was something women didn't do at that time, but they started to do it with her. She insisted on it. Her essay that is famous was printed in the Dial magazine, which was a magazine put out by the Transcendentalists, and this caused quite a stir. She finally made it into a book called Woman in the 19th Century. The basis for this essay is that the idea that man will rightfully inherit the earth when he becomes an elevated being, understanding of divine love. There have been periods in time when the world was more awake to this love, but people are sleeping now. However, everyone has the power to become enlightened. Man cannot find perfection because he is still burdened with selfish desires. But Fuller was optimistic and says that we are on the verge of a new awakening. She claims that in the past, man, like Orpheus for Eurydice, has always called out for woman. But soon will come the time when women will call out for men. And this is John Cummins' sermon on Margaret Fuller, the presumptuous woman. Margaret Fuller's life has relevance for every woman who ever wanted to be more than somebody's mother. It is regrettable that today, this was 1991, not one woman in 20 even knows her name, that we are still not entirely free of the social bias of her age is shown by the fact that the American Encyclopedia, which deigns to mention her in 3 short paragraphs, speaks at length of the man who was her father, the man to whom she was married, and the men with whom she worked. And no other woman If she had a mother or any other female relationships in her life, we are not told of it. The cemeteries of New England are filled with the graves of women, for in 1810, when Sarah Margaret Fuller was born in Bridgeport, just outside Boston, the Industrial Revolution had just begun. Cook stoves and pumps were for well water had only recently been invented and were just beginning to come into use. Nor did the men have anything to do with them when they were available. Women cooked in the fireplace, carried water from the well after breaking the ice. They were expected to work like stevedores all day, and birth control being virtually unknown, to conceive an indiscriminate number of children at night. Many women died in childbirth, and only a minority reached the age of 40. A fever carried from pregnant woman to pregnant woman on the hands of doctors was common. When Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had been lucky enough to study medicine in Paris, explained to the faculty at Harvard Medical School that it was the doctors who were killing women, his colleagues responded angrily that if that were true, it should not become known, and he should keep quiet. In any event, germs were unknown, as were microscopes, stethoscopes, and hematology. Doctors were left to guess what was wrong inside the body. Treatment consisted of lancing, leeching, and bleeding, and Margaret herself spent 6 weeks in bed after being bled for a headache. She nearly died from loss of blood. Many men had nice cemetery plots with a marker, and just beside them, just small stones saying Mary, his wife, Joan, his wife, Anne, his wife. Now, Margaret Fuller's own family was very much in the liberal tradition, revolutionists among the Tories, emancipationists among the slaveholders, Unitarians among the Calvinists. Her grandfather, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, refused to sign the Constitution because it permitted slavery. Her own father, Timothy Fuller, a lawyer farmer, is known to have read the English feminist Mary Wollstonecraft's book Vindication of the Rights of Women at least twice in his lifetime. He determined that his daughter would have a classical education as good as that of any man or boy, and he himself laid out her course of study, there being no public schools worthy of the name. There's one thing to be said about the Fullers. Descended from pilgrims, they were strictly in the Puritan tradition. This meant that although they were liberal, intellectual Unitarians and ahead of their time, they were coldly so. One did not speak of love, but of duty, and would no more think of embracing one another in a warm bear hug than grabbing an oak tree. Then and now this was 91, Unitarians were known as God's frozen people. Timothy Fuller loved his daughter, but from an emotional and conditional distance. From his weeks of absence in Washington, he would write to Margaret, "I remain your affectionate father. If you study..." Margaret Fuller was forever trying to gain some emotional acceptance from him, and by the time she was 8, she spoke Italian, French, German, Latin, and Greek, had read Ovid, Virgil, Homer, Aristotle, and Plato, and was scolded by her father for being so frivolous as to have read the complete works of William Shakespeare for recreation. When Margaret reached the age of 12 and began to turn into a woman, this frozen gentleman suddenly realized he had prepared his daughter for a life for which there was no place in society. He completely reversed his field and began frantically to urge her toward the domestic arts, such as sewing, cooking, and so on. Being 12 is confusing enough under the best of circumstances. Anyhow, it was too late. Margaret was too busy studying as a small child to have any friends, too knowledgeable as a young adult to have much in common with her peers, too plain of face to be manipulative. The result was that she was both shy and confrontive. She could and did demolish on first contact any witty or authoritative statement made by nearly anyone in Boston society. She came across as arrogant and in fact wrote in her own diary that she had no doubt that she no doubt had possessed the keenest intellect in America. She probably did. In any case, women who could not get a husband remain penniless, spinsters, living on the fringes of some fortunate relative's family as an unpaid mother's helper or domestic servant. A very few, graced with some sort of training in domestic arts, could become governesses if they could attach themselves to a rich family. The fact is, it was against the law for women to own property at all. And if a man died, his entire estate passed not to his widow, but to his nearest male relative. When Margaret's father died, all went to a stingy uncle, leaving her mother desperate. Younger brother and sister to slaughter her desperate mother, younger brother and sister to slaughter a cow and scrounge for vegetables in order to get through the winter. Margaret Fuller went immediately to teaching school for the philosopher Bronson Alcott, who insulted Boston's sensitivities by establishing a progressive school astonishingly ahead of his time. Instead of being lectured to and parroted back recitations from memory or what they had been told, children actually discussed ideas more or less in the Socratic manner. The idea that children should have any thoughts or anything to say other than what they were told seemed to encourage license and sin, and so shocked the Boston mentality that Bronson moved his school to Providence. The coup de grace was finally given the school when Alcott went so far as to accept a Negro student. The school closed and Alcott went home to Concord forever, never again to earn a penny, but to philosophize, while his daughter, Louisa May, earned his living for him by writing Little Women, as well as cooking his meals, keeping his house, and so on. She died in her 50s from continually taking calomel, the other great remedy of the day for a bad stomach. This, of course, contains mercury, which is pure poison. For those who got past the initial encounter, Margaret developed binding and lifelong friendships. Among them were the Peabody sisters, the Alcott family, the Hawthorns, Longfellows, and of course Emerson, whose poor pronunciation of German she frequently corrected, much to his annoyance. Back in Roxbury after the fall of Bronson's progressive school, she continued to earn her living by first taking private students, and then, in an age when anyone could fill a hall by lecturing on anything from cold baths to bumps on the heads, she held intellectual conversations with women for a fee, the subjects being such things as culture, ethics, philosophy of education. What is beauty? And her favorite subject, Greek mythology. Thus, while women were not supposed to have minds, and the highest accolade a woman could win were the words docile and receptive, she was forcing those women who could afford it at least to organize their thoughts and express themselves. Meanwhile, she continued to translate German philosophers, wrote a book on Goethe, and her own best book, Women in the 19th Century, in which she asked a fair shake for women, and which itself proved that modern women could do a man's work. Women in the 19th Century is a remarkable book. It is based on the belief that all souls are created equal, and in it, Margaret Fuller insists that if the age-old cycle is to be broken, whereby women derive their self-image from men, whose image of her is distorted by their own need to dominate, each woman must form her own idea of herself and, quote, lay aside all thought of being taught and led by men, unquote. It is this theme of self-reliance, reminiscent of Emerson's great essay, that makes her point still relevant today. Long after skirmishes over voting rights, divorce, property rights, and education have been all but one, it's still relevant today. That was in 91. Now, I don't know that all these voting rights, divorce, property rights, and education have been won yet. Such self-reliance must be achieved, she said, without expectation of help from even the most liberal-minded men, who, though they seemed glad to esteem women when they could, would never, in any extreme of despair, wish they were women, and ever describe any heroic quality in women as manly or surpassing her sex. Man, she says, is as generous as he knows how to be, but simply cannot resist his own need for power. Each wishes to be Lord in a little world, to be superior, at least over one. She points out what we now have come to realize, the fact of androgyny, that there is something of the feminine in everyone, something of the masculine in everyone. She attacks the double standard. This is a quote. You, say the men, must frown on vice, declining the attentions of the corrupt. This seems to us hard. Men have, for more than 100 years, berated women for countenancing vice, but at the same time have carefully hid from women its nature, so that preference, often shown by women for bad men, arises from a confused idea that they are bold and adventurous, acquainted with regions which women are forbidden to explore. As to marriage, it has been inculcated on women for centuries that men not only have stronger passions than them, but of a sort that would be shameful for them to share or even understand. That therefore they must confide in their husbands, submit implicitly to their will, that even the least appearance of coldness or withdrawal from whatever cause in the wife is wicked, because it is liable to turn her husband's thoughts to illicit indulgence. For a man is so constituted that he must indulge his passions or die. Here she is, in effect, asking for sex education for women and sexual restraint for men. Strong words at a time when a lady did not go out on the street without a bonnet for fear of being thought a loose woman. A spinster of 34 was not supposed to know what prostitution was, nor indeed what sex was. It was at this point that reviewers and enemies, seeing her as a threat to men, manners, and the morals of the day, described her as a presumptuous woman, and saw in her every evil they could imagine. Emerson, who had dropped out of the Unitarian ministry to retire to Concord, described her conversation as the most entertaining in America, and eventually invited her to join his Transcendentalist Club, which in fact was a very revolutionary group of intellectuals, many of whom were Unitarian ministers, Emerson, Ripley, Parker, and Channing, to name a few. Out of this group came the utopian Brook Farm experience, much of the anti-slavery movement in America, the establishment of the American public schools, most of the great American literature of the age, and in fact the beginnings of a genuinely American culture, not borrowed from Europe. Margaret got the job of editing for its first 2 years their little literary magazine, The Dial, mainly because, as usual, men were too lazy to do it. And there published the first poems of the shy bachelor, Henry David Thoreau. They had felt the need of a literary review of their own because the only other literary bulletin in American of any significance was the solidly conservative North American Review, which Emerson described as the snore of muses. These transcendentalists, in addition to being social radicals and reformers, scoffed at all the inherited traditions and ideas, lamenting that most men are weaklings, content to take their ideas, philosophies, and religion at second hand from old books, which were nothing more than the faded record of what other men had believed in other times, rather than to front their own experience and draw their own conclusions directly from life. Margaret was first among them, and her most famous phrase was, "I accept the universe," to which someone is said to have replied, "By God, she'd better." For a while she worked as a journalist and reviewer for Horace Greeley and the New York Tribune, setting herself the task of interviewing prostitutes in Sing Sing, an unheard of notion in her time. Noting the gentle nature of those she came to know, she was the first to comment that using sex to gain money was exactly what upper-class ladies did without quite realizing it. Well, these folks used sex to gain money while realizing exactly what they did. In 1846, at age 36, she realized her lifelong dream of sailing for Europe and spent 2 years in England visiting the English Unitarian Thomas Carlyle. She spent one winter in Paris, which she adored, saying that Paris was the distillation, the cream of Western culture, but saying that she could not live forever on cream. She departed for Italy, where she ran head-on into the heady combination of a social revolution she could espouse and a culture that recognized the sexuality of women. She participated in the Italian Revolution and the Siege of Rome, in the midst of which she fell in love with an Italian half her age, the Marquis Giovanni Angelo Osili, and had a baby out of wedlock at the age of 40. New England was jubilant with gossip. The castrating Iron Woman had fallen. I do not know, but I like her better for it, prattled Nathaniel Hawthorne, because she proved herself a very woman after all, and fell as the weakness of her sisters might. Her sexual transgression apparently relieved a good many people, along with Hawthorne, from taking her seriously. Others, and biographers ever since, have persisted in carrying forward the chauvinistic myth that Margaret really did not come into her own until she had been softened by love, submission, and motherhood. Even as a recent biographer perpetuates the myth, he says, Margaret no longer needed a cause. Her subjugation of herself to a man in the marriage act and the bearing and rearing of a child had made her soft and gentle and feminine at last. The psychological change is evident in her writing, etc., etc. What utter nonsense. If we can pass over the term subjugation, in which in itself reveals more of the biographer than of Margaret Fuller, we might not be that far from no longer needing a cause. She is sharper of mind and conviction than ever, writing home that, I have become an enthusiastic socialist. Elsewhere is no comfort, no solution for the problem of the times. Margaret Oseley and baby Angelo, 18 months, sailed for New England and home on May 17, 1850, aboard the English vessel Elizabeth, containing a cargo of marble slabs and 5 passengers. Almost in sight of New York Harbor, the vessel foundered on Fire Island. Margaret Oseley and the baby were drowned within sight of shore. Although Margaret Fuller, associated with many of the giants of her age, she should ultimately be remembered for what she was rather than what she did. She was the first and foremost American philosopher and intellectual, enforcing an unwilling society to accept the idea of a woman as a leading figure in adventures of the mind. She left an everlasting foothold for every woman who ever wanted to be more than someone's mother. I read an account of the shipwreck, which sort of reminded me of the shipwreck that they had in Italy last year, so close to the shore. Except in this, the people in New York didn't go out to rescue them. The first thing they brought down to the shore, people on the ship were watching, and they brought down a wagon so that they could pick up the stuff that was floating around and make money, scavenge the thing. And the normal captain of the ship had died of smallpox shortly after the ship left England, and this was a vice captain or whatever he would be called. And he stayed on the ship almost until the end. Margaret and Oseley would not leave, and the baby, they kept the baby, and finally several of the other people had left. Several of the other passengers made it to shore, and Oseley, the husband, jumped in and swam to shore, and somebody took the baby and was going to shore, but Margaret would not get off of the ship. And they never found her body. They found Oseley's jacket on the shore. She had been writing a book about the Italian Revolution and had mentioned this in the letters to friends, but her manuscript was not found, although Emerson sent Thoreau down to New York to search for this manuscript along the beach, but he didn't find anything. The only thing he found was Oseley's jacket and took a button from it, and he kept the button. So she was, after I read this, I got a book about, and it's a very detailed book. It's got a lot more. She did have a lot of women friends, whether she was intimate with them or not, but the book suggested it, that she was. So the story of her life, which is very interesting. That's it. That's my book.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was great. Please stand as you are willing and able, and joining in the singing of our closing hymn, number 301, Touch the Earth, Reach the Sky. please join me in the unison reading of the West Valley Mission Statement. This church provides a place to celebrate diversity, environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual searches. I believe Lisa has some closing words for us.
Hold on to what is good, even if it is a handful of earth. Hold on to what you believe, even if it is a tree which stands by itself. Hold on to what you must do, even if it is a long way from here. Hold on to life, even if it is easier letting go. Hold on to the hand of your neighbor, even when we are apart. That's adapted from the Pueblo.
Thank you for those closing words, and I think Tom's going to play us out with the postlude.